Hello, friends. Today we're going to discuss about certification in psychiatry. I'm Dr. Suresh Badadmat, Professor of Psychiatry, working at National Institute of Mental Health and Neurosciences, Bangalore. In this video, I'll be discussing about what do you mean by psychiatric certificate, what is the process of certification, how do we classify psychiatric certification, what are the general principles applied when you give psychiatric certificate, what are the process, what should be the content and format of psychiatric certificate, drafting, documenting, and finally, issuing of psychiatric certificate. Before we start, we need to understand what is medical certificate. Medical certificate is a written professional opinion from a doctor regarding the patient's medical examination, investigation, diagnosis, treatment, and recommendation. Invariably, it is a professional duty that all medical doctors must issue various medical certificate in their regular clinical practice. Invariably, the psychiatrist, being a doctor, is also duty bound to issue certain medical certificates. Please remember, medical certificate is a legal document that can be challenged in the court of law. All medical certificates are legal documents, even if the doctor pursues that it is not, or even he puts a disclaimer telling that it is not valid for legal purposes. Invariably, such disclaimer is not taken seriously in the court of law. The court will decide whether those evidences or documents and certificates to be considered or not. Any amount of disclaimer will not hold good in the court of law. Hence, this statement, not valid for legal purposes, is a joke of this century. Now let's define what is medical certificate. Medical certificate is a document issued by a registered medical practitioner stating the essential findings of the medical examination in writing in a concise format, which includes any of the following components such as assessment, investigation, diagnosis, and or management, including advice, suggestion, recommendations, including rehabilitation. That is about medical certificate. Now the question is, what is medical certification? It is a process of issuing a certificate by an authorized professional or authorities which encompasses the requisition by the patient, the consent of the patient, assessment, investigation, observation, documentation of the findings, and recommendations which are given in the certificate format after explaining the risk and benefit of those certificate. Now moving to psychiatric certificate. Psychiatric certificate is very personal and contains sensitive information. Hence, the doctor must respect patient privacy and confidentiality. The reason being is the persons with mental illness are invariably subjected to stigma and discrimination. At present, it is at very high in any society. Hence, one need to be aware with regard to mental health laws, human rights law, with regard to persons with mental illness. Similarly, the psychiatric certification, that is, the process of issuing a certificate by a psychiatrist with an appropriate qualification or training in psychiatry, is a must. Here, the process encompasses receiving a request letter, accepting, knowing the timeline within which we need to issue the certificate, obtaining consent, assessment, investigation, diagnosis, observation, drafting, and issuing the medical certificate. But here you need to understand, it is not just a certificate, it is a process of all these which is given in a written document to a person. Now let's understand what are the challenges in psychiatric certification. The inherent nature of mental illness, which affects the brain, and it is manifested in abnormal behavior, abnormal thoughts, and emotion. Invariably, psychiatric illnesses are invisible, most of them are subjective in nature, and many of them have poor insight. I have seen many patients refusing to take treatment and becoming angry whenever a certificate is issued. Many a time, even they refuse to take disability certificate because of poor insight, many a time because of stigma. Please remember, psychiatric illnesses are difficult to diagnose because there are no lab tests. That means there is no positive lab test to say, yes, this person has psychiatric illness. Hence, they are called as invisible illnesses and invisible disability. At present, there is no objective way of measuring the diagnosis of psychiatric illness. Further, it is difficult to quantify the severity of psychiatric illness. Only the person who has MD psychiatry or DNB, who have been trained in quantifying the illness, will be able to do so. Further, if it is a new case, that is, the first time the patient is presenting himself in front of a psychiatrist, in such a scenario, issuing any psychiatric certificate becomes very difficult unless the psychiatrist has seen the patient many times, well documented information is available, medical record is available. In such scenario, the psychiatrist feels comfortable in issuing the certificate for the first time. However, many a time, if there is no adequate information, adequate history, it is a professional discretion of the psychiatrist to refuse to give certificate. Invariably in psychiatry, issuing psychiatric certificate is based upon history, clinical assessment, clinical examination, ward observation, mental status examination, cognitive functions which are done on serial basis, that is maybe every day for the next 15 days, invariably admitting the patient to the hospital and observing him, and finally documentation. These are the key ingredients to issue psychiatric certificate. Considering the high stigma and discrimination of persons with mental illness, a psychiatrist or any medical officer should know there is human rights violation which occurs with regard to persons with mental illness. Invariably, if there is a certificate which is available to the spouse, invariably they will approach for divorce. Many a time, the employees may check them out of the job. That means they may lose job, loss of property, denial of legal right, and so many discrimination which occurs on day-to-day basis for persons with mental illness. Hence, any doctor, when he is issuing a psychiatric certificate, he needs to be very careful. And one need to know about the confidentiality clause under Mental Health Care Act of 2017. Now let's classify various psychiatric certificates. This classification is done by our colleagues, that is Dr. Manjunath and myself. This is for the purpose of academic purposes only. Here, this classification is not a watertight compartment. Invariably, this classification helps you to understand what are the different ways the certificates are issued and what is the process. Let's look into the certificate. There are two important types. One is procedural certificate, another one is on request certificate. What is procedure? The virtue of examining the patient, and because of there is a statute or a legislation, you have to issue a certificate. The second one is because of forensic issues. It can be criminal case or civil case. Moving to the on request. If the patient requests for sickness certificate, it may be disability certificate, and further ability certificate that he is fit to stand or he is fit to go back to the job. In such scenario, we may have to give certificate. Let's understand in detail. As I mentioned, procedural certificate and on request certificate. In the procedural based certificate, there are legislation based certificate, forensic based certificate. As forensic is criminal case, civil case, and executive decision, that is government officials asking for certificate. It may be invariably for fitness to take a gun license, maybe testamentary capacity, fitness to join back to duty. Now let's discuss about legislation based certification. Here, here these certification has to be given because they are enforced by the implementation of legislation, and the psychiatrist is under the obligation to fulfill the responsibility under respective legislation. For example, Mental Health Care Act of 2017. Before you admit a person under 89 section or 90, one need to examine and issue a certificate. By the virtue of this legislation, you have to do that. Similarly, Right to Persons with Disability Act 2016. When the patient requests for disability assessment, you need to do the assessment and issue the certificate. Similarly, Narcotropics, Drugs and Psychotropic Act 1985. You may have to issue a certificate that the person has received de-addiction treatment. Similarly, National Trust Act for Autism, Cerebral Palsy, and Multiple Disability. Here, you may have to issue a certificate for issuing guardianship from the National Trust Act. Similarly, moving to the forensic based, here, as I mentioned, criminal cases, civil cases, and executive decision, that is government based. With regard to criminal cases, if the person may be a victim of a sexual assault, maybe violence, maybe a murder, and invariably you need to know whether the accused had mental illness or not. In such cases, you may have to issue the certificate for the investigating agency. Similarly, with regard to civil cases, it may be related to property, movable and immovable. With regard to divorce, whether a person has mental illness, impotence, with regard to health insurance also. Executive decisions, that is, the employee may ask for fitness to rejoin the job, unfit to be in the job, change of job. Such kind of certificate may be requested from an employee with regard to their employer. Now moving to on request certificate. There are three types in this. One is sickness based. A person would have been taking treatment under you, it may be because of depression. In such a scenario, for his absence from work or for academics, you may have to issue sickness certificate, treatment certificate, or both. Similarly, dysfunction certificate. It can be medical leave, psychiatric disability, unfit certificate. Functional certificate. Here, whether a person is psychiatrically fit to undergo surgery, for driving, for a pilot, to armed forces, whether the person is fit to handle arms and ammunition, possessing firearm. These are the ability certificate or functionality certificate the psychiatrist may be called for issuing certificate. Now let's understand the principles of psychiatric certification. You need to understand it is a process of issuing a certification. It is not just a piece of paper. Here, the first principle you need to understand is the clinical decision making pathway of certification is based upon the various stakeholders involved in the path. First and the foremost, who is the seeker of the certificate? Who is going to assess the person with mental illness regarding psychiatric certification? Who is going to issue the certificate? Who is going to submit this certificate to the required person? And finally, the recipient or the address where the certificate has to go. Now let's ask all these questions. First one is, who is the seeker of the certificate? Whether it is the patient himself, it is the family member, is it the husband, is it the neighbor, is it the employer, is it the investigating officer, or the court magistrate is asking. You need to know who is asking the certificate regarding a Mr. X. Similarly, the second one is why they are asking the certificate. That is purpose of certificate. Whether it is for leave, whether it is fitness to join a job, is it for income tax, is it for social welfare benefit, or else is it for insanity defense? A person has done something and he wants to use psychiatry as a defense for his unruly behavior. Similarly, what kind of certificate they are asking? What is the content they want in the certificate? Is it illness related content? Is it dysfunction related content for disability certificate? Or else whether he is fit to join back to duty, he is fit to stand trial, is it testamentary capacity? So those, what is the content and what is the purpose, you need to ask. The fourth one is, what is the timeline we have? How much time we have to issue the certificate? The timeline denotes the urgency of issuing the certificate. And also check, when was the request asked for the certificate? The fifth one is, where will this requested certificate to be submitted? That is the address where the certificate has to go. Here, this answer will know where this certificate will be submitted and what is the purpose. Based upon that, you can address the certificate to the person whom it is concerned. Finally, who is going to take this certificate? Is it by transportation by the patient himself, family members, or the employee, or the employer is carrying, or is it sent by post or email? And what does the person with mental illness desires? How the certificate has to be transported? All these 6 important principles you need to keep in mind. So, there is called as SPC TAT as a mnemonic. You need to know all the 6 important principles. That is, who is the seeker of the certificate? What is the purpose of this certificate? What is the content of this psychiatric certification? What is the timeline you have for certification? When did the illness start? Why they are asking? When it is to be submitted? What is the urgency? To whom it is submitted? That is addressee, where you have to submit, and how the certificate will be transported to the person Mr. X, because this transportation, invariably, we make mistake. We may give the certificate to somebody else. That means violation of confidentiality. You may send the certificate somewhere else. And this may be, again, violation of privacy may occur. Moving to the important aspect, this is the process of psychiatric certification. If you know the process, then you may not make any mistakes when you are issuing the certificate. Hence, please follow the step-by-step process of certification. Step 1, the early phase or inquiry phase of the certification. Second one is determination phase. Third one is assessment phase. Fourth one is observation. Fifth is documentation. Sixth is decision and drafting the phase of certificate. Seventh is issuing. Eighth is transportation or transmission of the certificate. Now let's move with the inquiry phase. In the inquiry phase, who is requesting the certificate? What is the purpose of the certificate? Whether it is a new case or an old case? How much time we have in hand to issue this certificate? Whom should we address this certificate? Is there any medical legal issues? Is there any forensic issues? Whether it is a FIR is there? Whether the court is asking who is going to transport the certificate? What is your role in issuing this certificate? Moving to the second, determination to examine and issue a certificate. What are the patient-related factors? Now the question is, by whom, for whom the certificate is issued? Is it a valid request? Is it the patient asking? Whether the patient's husband or the spouse is asking? Employer is asking? Whomever they may ask, whether the patient has given consent for the assessment, consent for evaluation, consent for issuing the certificate. Hence, you need to have a proper request letter for assessment. The next step is you need to know whether it is an old case or new case, whether you have adequate medical records so that you can issue the certificate, whether they are asking for abnormalcy or whether they are looking for normalcy certificate, whether that is disability certificate or ability certificate. Disability is how much disability is there. Ability is whether he is fit to join back to the duty. Now let's look into the doctor-related factors. The doctor or the psychiatrist should know whether he has treated the patient or not, whether he is asking for a retrospective certification, how much time you have in hand, do you have expertise in the area of what the certification is asked, is there any special procedure you have to do, whether you are comfortable doing OPD basis, whether you require inpatient cases, whether you would like to admit and observe them. All these are professional discretion, and you need to know how will you do the assessment. Based upon the request, check for the valid documents. Based upon whether it is a reasonable request, whether you have the expertise, you can accept for assessment. You can refer telling that I don't have the expertise. You go back to the old psychiatrist because they know the case very well, or else you can reject telling that it is not a reasonable request. But however, document the reason for accepting, referring, or rejecting, because the person may challenge the decision in the court of law. Moving to the assessment phase. In the assessment phase, the psychiatrist has to decide whether he will do inpatient assessment or outpatient assessment. This is purely the professional discretion. If he is a young psychiatrist and it is a new case, invariably they will ask for admission. If the patient is old, he has come to psychiatrist many times, all the medical records are available, and the psychiatrist is experienced, he can give certificate on OP basis only. Further, one need to take the consent of the patient. Here, invariably the triple consent has to be taken. The consent for admission or the assessment, consent for referring to the board if there is a board assessment is required, and evaluation and certifying by the board is required. Third one is transmitting the certificate to the employer or to the court. Hence, I call it as a triple consent. Next, once the consent is taken, you may admit or evaluate on OPD basis, do a detailed evaluation, and keep those documents. Please do collect all possible information. Here, the information can be taken from various sources. I would rather call it as a collateral sources. It may be from the patient, patient's spouse, patient's family members, relatives, friends. If there is an FIR, talk to the investigating officer, collect the FIR, collect the postmortem report. If you want to know about the patient's occupation, talk to the employer, talk to the employees, talk to the colleagues at the workplace, talk to friends, and various other information if you require. Please do collect all information. Before you do this, you need to take consent that I'm contacting all these people. The patient may say, I don't want to give consent to contact Mr. X or Y, Z. In such a scenario, please document. And if you are not able to get the valid or reliable information, you can refuse to give consent, or you can say, I am unable to complete the assessment. Similarly, talk to the past psychiatrist, collect all treatment details, investigation documents, have a copy of that in your file. Do a thorough general physical examination, investigation, mental status examination, serial MSE, serial cognitive function, serial ward observation. All these formulates into assessment phase. Now let's move into observation phase. If you have admitted the patient, please do serial ward observation, whether the patient takes medication regularly, how is his cooperation and ward behavior, what is his attitude towards the other inmates in the ward, what about his activities of daily living, when he gets up, how is his personal hygiene, does he take bath, does he wear clothes properly, whether he requires assistance, whether he requires prompting, how much is his dependency on his daily activities with the family members, how much is his functional, are there any deficit behavior, that is asocialization, not meeting anyone, not talking to any person, are there any excessive behavior, that is shouting, hyperactive behavior, dancing, singing, look at the social interaction, behavior with others, and finally the biological function, that is sleep, bowel and bladder habits. Moving to the fifth, the documentation phase. As I mentioned earlier, the issuing the certificate, standing the scrutiny of the certificate requires a good documentation. Hence, document all the assessment, ward observation, file all the investigation, Properly document the serial word observation, serial MSE, serial cognitive function, summarize your findings, logically build the argument for your conclusion so that even if it is challenged, you are able to explain the court logically, and finally, making the decision for diagnosis. That documentation should be proper and thorough. Finally, talking about decision and drafting phase. Here, you need to decide whether you are going to give the certificate individually by yourself, or else will you refer to a board, that is medical board, or you will refer to a appropriate authority or to a team of doctors who are going to certify. Draft the certificate. Check whether there is any preformed format is available from a respective department. For example, for disability, there is already a preformed format is available. Similarly, for income tax, check whether there is any format. That is the very important requirement. If you have any doubt, contact your seniors or else a forensic psychiatrist to clarify your doubts. Invariably, whenever you have doubt, please talk to your colleague and take a second opinion. Look for preformed formats. Check the number of copies required. Address the official when you're drafting. Don't address the person directly. Suppose you are writing to an investigating officer, please write there the investigating officer. Don't write it in the name of the judge or in the name of the investigating officer, because this is an official document. You'll be writing to the ex officio, the person who is there on this post. For example, if you are writing a letter to the HOD, you're not going to write his name. You'll write a letter telling that, or an application to the HOD. Similarly, when you write to the director, to the principal, you'll not write by the name, because it is not a personal letter. It is an official letter. Whenever you write it, please document the date, time, and signature. Moving to the issuing phase. Verify the certificates finally. Check what are the procedures involved in the hospital. How do you issue the certificate? Does it have to go through the HOD, through the RMO, or through the medical superintendent? Whether the principal has to sign. So check what is the procedure followed in your hospital. Talk to them, get the clarification, and whether you will be issuing the certificate directly to the patient, then you need to check the ID of the patient, and you will be issuing to the patient, and you will take the signature of the patient. Similarly, if there is an authorization letter by the patient, you will be issuing to the NR or to the employer or to the court directly. And when you are issuing the certificate, please take the acknowledgement certificate or a signature from the person telling that I have collected the certificate. Finally, explain the risk of this certificate. If it falls in the wrong hand, what are the benefits of the certificate? Finally, transportation or transmission. Invariably, you have issued the certificate to the patient. It is your duty to transmit this certificate directly to the court or to the police officer or to the investigating officer or to whomever it is concerned. Before you do that, please do take the consent from the patient. And you may post it or you may email the certificate to the person, and keep a copy of the certificate in the patient file. Whenever you are posting it, please do registered post so that you know who has received the certificate. Now, let's look into the types of psychiatric certificates. Based upon who is requesting, who is issuing the certificate, what are the law governing the certificate. The first one is based upon the procedure. If you are doing a capacity assessment, then the people who are going to assess is either the registered medical practitioner, psychiatrist, or a mental health professional. This is based on the Mental Health Care Act of 2017. With regard to inpatient admission, either the psychiatrist or mental health professional has to do. For fitness to stand trial, invariably it has to be done by a forensic psychiatrist or a psychiatrist who has been trained. This is either through the Indian Penal Code or else Bharatiya Nyaya Samhita or else Bharatiya Nagarika Suraksha Samhita 2023 or else Bharatiya Sakshya Adhiniyam 2023. Based upon that, you will be do the assessment. With regard to testamentary capacity, the psychiatrist will be doing either the tort law or under the contract law. With regard to insanity defense, psychiatrist will be doing, again, based upon BNS. With regard to sickness certificate, it will be the psychiatrist or the trained medical officer under the NMC Act of 2019. For diagnosis, treatment, medical leave, either the psychiatrist or the trained medical officer based upon the National Medical Commission Act. With regard to Disability Act, certifying authority as mentioned under the NMC Act or by the NMC rules or the guidelines. Further, for guardianship under the NTA Act, that is National Trust Act, with regard to IDD, that is intellectual disability, SLD or autism, under the RPWD Act you will be issuing. With regard to fitness to rejoin the job, either it may be a psychiatrist or maybe the board will be issuing and it will be under the contract law. With regard to marriage and divorce, either a psychiatrist or maybe mental health review board under section 105 of the Mental Health Care Act, they will be issuing. With regard to pre-surgical fitness, that is before a surgery, if you have to issue a certificate, psychiatrist will be doing it. With regard to psychiatric fitness, with regard to organ transplantation, it is under the TOA Act and the psychiatrist will be doing it. With regard to treatment completion certificate, invariably psychiatrist from the NDPS Act. With regard to transgender certification, that is Rights of the Transgender Act of 2019, under that either the psychiatrist will be doing or the mental health professional. Now let's look into the content and format of this medical certificate. As per the Indian Medical Council, either the Regulation 2002 or else the 2023 regulation can be used. As per the 2002 regulation, code number 1.3.3, a registered medical practitioner shall maintain a register of a medical certificates giving the full details of the certificate is issued. Always a written request to be taken before issuing the certificate. You need to keep a copy of the certificate when you're issuing it. When issuing a medical certificate, a psychiatrist shall always enter the identification mark of the patient, or else he will ask for the photo ID like Aadhaar card or PAN card to know whom he is issuing and whom he has assessed. Document the signature or a thumb mark of the patient if the patient refuses to give photo ID. This is how the format, which is given by the Medical Council of India on 16/4/2013. This contains invariably signature of the patient or a thumb impression, identification mark, signature of the medical attendant or the registered medical practitioner, and the content of the certificate, which clearly talks about what is the content. With regard to MCI or NMC requirement, the nature and the probable diagnosis or the provisional diagnosis or a differential diagnosis has to be mentioned in the certificate. The certificate must be accompanied by a brief resume of the case or the case summary, the symptoms, cause, and duration to be written. Please do keep a copy of the certificate with you. Further, please document the demographic details, your name as a medical practitioner, your license number or registration number, the date of examination, the nature of the diagnosis, provisional diagnosis, differential diagnosis. If you are unable to come to any conclusion, you write that not yet diagnosed. Further, you may ask for recommendation to inpatient admission, further investigation. You may have to comment about the degree of incapacitation, injury, and illness. Further, you may have to be very specific with regard to period of leave and also the time of medical illness has to be documented, duration of treatment, recommendation, advice or follow-up, and also please take the acknowledgement receipt from the patient that he has received the certificate. Now let's discuss about the ethical issues in giving psychiatric or medical certificate. Ethical issues: triple consent, consent for assessment, consent for referral required or for investigation, and also consent to send the certificate to the required person. It may be to the employee, to the investigating officer, or to the court. If you are giving a false or a fake certificate, you may lose your license to practice. So do not tamper with the certificate and do not omit certain things or write something which is not appropriate. But however, mistakes can occur in the certificate. Please don't do it deliberately. If the doctor issues a false certificate under the Medical Council of India, Regulation 7.7 code, it clearly says that any registered medical practitioner who is shown to have signed or given under his name and authority any such certificate, notification, report, or document of a similar character which is untrue, misleading, or improper, his name can be deleted from the medical register. Now let's look into the legal issues in issuing psychiatric certificate or medical certificate. As per section 197, that is Indian Penal Code, whoever issues or signs any certificate which is false, that is now covered under Bharatiya Nyaya Samhita, section 234. Under that it says, whoever issues or signs any certificate required by a law to be given or to be signed or to be relating to any fact of which the certificate is by law admissible in evidence, knowing or believing that such certificate is false in any material point, shall be punished in the same manner the way it is given as a false evidence. Similarly, using a true certificate known to be it is false. This is covered under Indian Penal Code, section 198. Whoever corruptly uses or attempt to use any such certificate as a true certificate knowing that it is a false in any material point shall be punished in the same manner as giving false evidence. Currently that is covered under section 235 of Bharatiya Nyaya Samhita Act 2023. Similarly, this can also be covered under the Prevention of Corruption Act 1988. Here, the Prevention of Corruption Act can also be applied against a doctor working in the government. Further, if you are issuing a wrong certificate, violating the patient rights, giving a certificate knowing that it is a false, knowing that it is wrong, and you have issued the certificate, you can be punished even under the Mental Health Care Act of 2017. The punishment can extend from 6 months to 2 years of imprisonment with or without fine. So, my dear friends, please be very careful when you are issuing a psychiatric certificate. Finally, what is the weightage given for the psychiatric certificate in the court of law? These medical certificate or psychiatric certificate needs to be produced in the court of law or submitted to the court. Once it is produced, the doctor or the psychiatrist who has issued need to attend the court, take a oath, and testify telling that it is his signature. And also, that certificate should withstand the scrutiny of the cross-examination or the opposite party. And in spite of all this, that evidence will be considered as a corroborative evidence or a circumstantial evidence. That means it is not a substantial evidence. So, please remember, your psychiatric certificate is a corroborative evidence in the court of law. Let's look into the general principles of psychiatric certification. Coming to the last part of my presentation. Whenever you are issuing a certificate, you have to examine the patient, except is ex officio. That means you are working in a department and the patient has been examined by your retired HOD. Now you are the HOD at this point of time. In such a scenario, by the virtue of being an ex officio, you may have to issue a certificate mentioning that this person has been examined by a retired so-and-so officer. By the virtue of being in the ex officio, I am issuing this certificate, but I have not examined him. That means the principle is you have to issue a certificate only to those patients you have examined. Whenever you are giving a medical certificate for leave, please give only for 2 weeks only maximum. Do not cross that limit. If you think you have to give more than 2 weeks, that means you have to examine the patient every week or every alternate week, knowing that the patient is severely ill, or else you may have to admit the patient. Hence, give only for 1 week or 2 weeks, and after every 2 weeks, you have to re-examine, document the patient's progress, whether it is deteriorating or improvement. That monitoring of the progress is very essential, and document is very essential. Don't issue certificate for 1 month, 2 months, or 6 months. If you do that, invariably there will be a doubt casted upon the person who has issued the certificate. But however, if you are able to defend, then it is fine. But however, don't give for more than 2 weeks. If you are issuing the certificate for longer duration, please be ready with your logical explanation. And whenever you are issuing a certificate, the presence of patient is very, very essential, so that you examine, document, and you are issuing the certificate to the patient only. Whenever you are issuing a certificate, please take application or request from the patient for the certificate. Before you issue, identify the patient, take the photo ID. If the patient refuses to give photo ID, please take thumb impression and then go ahead with the assessment. Whenever you are issuing a certificate to a particular person, please mention to the principal, to the employer, to the investigating officer, to the court. Avoid writing whoever it may concern so, because this is not a general certificate. You are giving a psychiatric certificate. Hence, be specific and ask the patient to whom it should be addressed, and take consent for transmitting that certificate to that person. Issue a certificate only on the day when you are doing OPD. Do not issue the certificate at home. Do not issue the certificate when you are not working or you are on holiday. And issue the certificate on the date of examination. Do not issue the certificate retrospectively, because you may get into trouble. There was a patient where he had asked for a retrospective certificate, and the psychiatrist had issued retrospectively, but on that day, this person was in another place committing a crime. Hence, be careful when you are issuing a certificate retrospectively. And whenever you issue a certificate, please document the factual information, the history, clinical assessment, mental status examination, severity, disability, medications, your advice, and recommendations. Whatever you write, this certificate is not for legal purpose, is not valid in the court of law. It is just making mockery of yourself. So don't write this. It is not intended for legal purpose. Please do mention the diagnosis, provisional diagnosis, your recommendation. Many a time the patient may refuse to say, please don't document my diagnosis. Now it is the professional discretion, either to put the definition or put the ICD code or the DSM-5. Based upon that only you will issue the certificate. Do not hide the diagnosis, because if you are omitting certain important categories of the diagnosis as per the MCI or the NMC, you have to be very careful. Never give a contradictory medical certificate when already there is a certificate given by somebody else. If it is challenged in the court of law, please take it to the medical board for examination, and the medical board will issue the certificate. Avoid abbreviations and medical jargons in the certificate. Whenever you are issuing a fitness certificate, know the process in your hospital, whether it has to be given by the medical board or a disability board or by a medical superintendent or by a group of doctor. Please know that. Please keep a copy of the medical certificate in the patient file. Issue the medical certificate only to the patient or by authorization letter to the legal guardian or to the NR. Take the acknowledgement. Please do not cross your specialty boundary. If you are a psychiatrist, issue the certificate for psychiatry only. Don't issue for obstetrics. Don't issue certificate for orthopedics, because you are crossing your professional boundaries. Hence, issue the certificate in your expertise area, and avoid writing, I'm giving this certificate based on the humanitarian. This person is very nice person. You should give only this food. Don't write those things. They are not medical certificate. And issue the certificate for the period you have examined. Don't issue the certificate for which you are not examined. Please do not tamper with the medical certificate. To conclude, my dear friends, psychiatric certificate is a legal document and it is very sensitive. This certificate, if it falls into the wrong hand, there will be stigma and discrimination against the person, and that person may give complaint to mental health review board or to the state medical council. Hence, you have to be very, very careful when you are issuing a psychiatric certificate. Know the certificate, why they are asking, who is asking, whom to be issued, what is the timeline, and how will you issue the certificate and how will you transmit the certificate. Please know the process of issuing the certificate and please follow that. Issuing the certificate is your duty. But however, if you are unable to come to any conclusion, keep the diagnosis open. Tell that it is a provisional diagnosis, give differential diagnosis. If you are unable to come to any conclusion, please mention that it is not yet diagnosed. Please know the ethical and legal issues with regard to psychiatric certificate. Thank you very much for your valuable time. Stay safe.